I might start recording all my.
All right.
I'll just stay home.
I have 1:30. I think it's time to get the meeting started, so I'm going to formally call the meeting to order. At this point in time, since this is her first meeting, we have a new commissioner who's present today, Lauren Quayle-Sill. And what we do, Lauren, is most of the time, I usually start to my left out of a force of habit, and commissioners introduce themselves based on with their name and where they're from. So if you would tell us where you're from, we'll go ahead and start the other introductions.
I am from Hutchinson. My name's Lauren. You can call me Quayle-Sill or Lauren Sill.
Troy Spohr, Oakley, Kansas.
Emmerich Cross, Kansas City.
I'm Gerald Lauber from Topeka.
Gary Hazlett from Lakin.
Aaron Ryder, Columbus.
Sheila Camus Pratt.
Chris Tymason, Legal Counsel.
Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary Pratt.
Brad Lovelace, Secretary, Topeka.
Okay, are there any additions or deletions to the minutes, Sheila? Or agenda, I mean?
The revised agenda that you were given and that was on the table just had a change of order of the workshop items is all. But it's the same one that's in the briefing book.
It's the same one that's in the briefing book?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'd like a motion that we approve or discuss the June 13th minutes.
I move we approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the minutes of the previous meeting be approved. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. There's a good-sized group here today. I'm pleased with that. Secretary Lovelace reminded me it is tomato season, and that tomatoes may come flying at this table, but if anybody chooses to throw tomato, if they're really good ones, can I have mine whole and then direct the tomato tossing over to the staff to the right? Also, at this time, we encourage general public comment on non-agenda items. Does anybody have anything they'd like to bring up to the group that is not on the agenda? And would you please come up and state your name so that Sheila can get it in the minutes, please?
My name is Ben Allen. I'm from Chautauqua County, Kansas, and I'm not going to throw tomatoes. I'm going to pat you on the back. I've got a dog that finds wounded and dead deer, and I want to thank you all for letting us do that and use the dogs. This past year, he went out 38 times. The year before, he went out 28 times. So there's a lot of deer that we go recover that otherwise would be lost. So I want to thank you all for letting us use the dogs. What I would suggest, it's kind of tough to follow this dog through the brush where these deer go, across the creeks. I would like to be able to take them off leash. My dog does not chase deer randomly or anything like that. He's under control all the time, but it is really a struggle to go, and I'm getting a little older too, to go where these deer go and go find them. When I go into Oklahoma, I call the game warden or text them and notify them that I'm going to be in a certain area, and that's what they want for approval. So I think if we did that in the state of Kansas and have a legit list of people that are doing this, I think we could keep everything on the up and up and not have guys out there chasing deer. I really don't see that anybody's going to be chasing deer with their dogs. But I just want to thank you again for letting us use dogs because it's been really good. I also manage about 10,000 acres of land down in that country for grazing and for hunting. We've been doing this for about 12 or 14 years. I deal strictly with out-of-state deer hunters is what I deal with. I only had 3 of my guys this year that did not get tags. I've got a buddy that's an outfitter down there. He had 42 hunts booked. 20 of these hunters did not draw tags. If I cut your paycheck in half and your paycheck in half, there's not much money left. we've got to where we really depend on this income for Chautauqua and Elk County down there. We're really poor. You guys have a balancing act to do. I know that. You got to keep the in-state guys happy, which they're all my buddies too. But this is a major economic boost to our area down there. What I would like to suggest doing is if a guy or gal has been through the permit drawing system and has done everything legit and is not drawn, then let's let them pay a bonus price of like $300 or something like that to come and hunt this year. Because my guys have 3-year leases, a lot of them. They've got money in corn feeders, corn, lease fees and stuff like that. But if we wouldn't just shut them totally out, I think we're better off. And I can't remember how many guys weren't drawn, but it was 3,000 or 4,000 if I remember correctly. But even if 2,000 of them decide to pay the $300, if you put all those zeros together, I think it adds up to $600,000. That's a lot of money to go into the department. So I would just like to suggest that and not just shut these guys totally out. That's my request. But if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them or comments. But it's really, really important to see these guys come to the poor income counties in the state and spend their dollars. It really is. Thank you for your time.
I guess I have a question as to why the deer dogs have to be on a leash.
Originally, I think it was a new thing, and anytime you have a new thing, a new authorized activity, that this was a way to get the foot in the door and be able to use it and to provide some level of assurance that they wouldn't be hounds running deer.
That's correct.
And I think that I'm willing to review that. I want to see what law enforcement's thoughts are as to see whether or not there's any people running deer. I sort of doubt it. But I know I always had my bird dogs drag a rope. I suppose you could drop the rope. Slips out of your fingers. But I think we could look into it.
I appreciate that, because when you've got a buck deer that's wounded after you and your dog, you don't want him on a leash. You want him to be able to get away too.
Yeah, I understand. And also on the non-resident, I talked a little bit, and Levi may be able to, I don't know if he has all the statistics for this year. This was the first year, because of increased demand, that all of our, I think Levi, you said all of our tags were set out and there were no leftovers. We still probably, I want to say 20% of, a little over 20% of our tags are allocated to non-residents, and last year we had probably a 97% success ratio.
Correct.
I know of one particular case where they applied as a group, and that extra, demand we had. The problem we've had in the past is that there's been a big push by resident hunters that, we kind of said we would stop at 15%, at 17%, and then we sort of blinked and looked the other way, and now we're over 20%. And there's a lot of people wanting us to reverse that. And I think what you find is, not taking economics into consideration, as the non-resident hunters come in and participate, resident participation is forced downward. And so we do get, it's a balancing act, and we do get it from both directions. Most of the calls I get are not people who are embracing the plight of outfitters, but rather complaining that they have been squeezed out with no place to hunt. I understand the poor county concept too. So anybody else have any other questions or comments on this subject? It is a traditional matter we deal with. Secretary Lovelace?
I think I really do appreciate your input, and it'll be fun to follow up with you and get some more details from you. But Levi, do you know the numbers in terms of the percentages that were turned down? Okay. Okay, so we'll have those over time, because clearly if 50% of those hunters that applied didn't get it, that's anomalous in our experience. Typically, it's a much smaller percentage that didn't get it. The other factor, the chairman did a good job of covering several points. The other factor that we do bear in mind is economics, but it's long-term economics. There's no doubt that in the short term we could sell a whole bunch more permits, but we know how valuable the reputation of the agency is. And, I'm sorry, not the agency, but the herd that we all share. Excuse me, somebody's calling. My wife called to correct me. Yeah, we recognize the value of maintaining the herd at this high quality level because reputationally that means a lot. It means a lot of money to our landowners. And what we've gotten a number of calls from people who say, hey, my group of hunters came 7, 8, 9 years in a row, and now they didn't draw this year. And so what we're doing is we're coaching them a little bit on how to go out on the internet and find other hunters, because the reality is, as demand increases, the value of their land increases too, the value of the services that you guys provide. And so we think that'll be a benefit in the long run. In the short term, I know that can lead to adjustments, but one fellow I talked to just a couple weeks ago said the group of hunters from Georgia that's been coming for 9 years in a row won't be coming this year. They said, keep the money we put down. We'll be back in a year. In the meantime, we have no problems if you get somebody else who comes in and hunts this year. So hopefully, long term, this high quality deer herd that I think our folks are doing a really good job of managing for will lead to more revenue, for our landowners. So,
A comment back to that, the guys that hunt with me, a lot of times they don't even kill a deer. They let them walk.
right.
They've done a real good job of managing the deer that are on those properties. So they're doing a good job of managing it. It's a balancing act. I understand where you're at, but it is. The outfitter I told you about, he's written checks for $80,000 for lease payments to landowners. A lot of dollars. The landowners have got to where they depend on that income. I don't know if any of you are in the ag business, whether you've got a cattle lease or a farming lease, but we like to see a long-term lease so we can kind of plan on things. Same with them. When we go to a landowner now and we don't give them that check, it's really hard now to go back and find, somebody says, well, get some other hunters in there. If they're coming to the state of Kansas, 95% of the time, they know where they're going to hunt before they get here. They don't just come driving in, get a tag, and come hunting. So appreciate what y'all do. I just want to let y'all know what it's like out there in the country from an economic point of view, from the deer management. But once again, I appreciate you letting us use the dogs. If we can take them off leash, I would really like that, because
I don't know under whose supervision tracking dogs are, but if we could have somebody in the department kind of review that, and let's kind of look and see how firm we are on maintaining a leash law like that.
Okay.
But I appreciate your time.
You bet. Thank you all.
All right. Is there any other public comment on?
What breed of the dogs do you run? I was just curious.
He's a border collie dog. I've had him all my life for working cattle and doing stuff like that. We had noticed that this dog had a really good nose, and they're real intelligent. And anyway, he found a deer 3 years ago or 4 for one of my hunters, and I thought, well, I'm going to work on this just a little bit. And so we've got to doing the deal. He was on the Outdoor Channel about 2 weeks ago or 3. He'll be on it again in September. Bucks at Tecumseh. You guys that hunt, I don't get all that stuff on TV, but we found they were hunting around El Dorado, and he went up there and found one, and it's all videotaped and filmed, and it's on TV now. So it's kind of a, it's kind of a fun deal, but it gets in your blood. I bird hunt and do stuff like that. I haven't killed a deer in 20 years, but I do like to go find them. Any other questions? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just to clear up when we were talking about the stats for last year, Nadia looked these up. We had 21,816 permits available, and that number of non-resident permits has been really consistent over the last at least 5 years. It's been very, very consistent. We had 24,024 applicants, so we had an increase of over almost 1,600 applicants this year over last year, and there was 2,208 applicants that did not receive a permit. The overall success rate was almost 90% this year, so it was still a high percentage of our non-residents draw a permit, but there were more than we've ever had not draw this year, and that's one of the reasons we've had some of the comments.
And if you had a group of hunters that applied with a group draw,
Everybody draw, right?
then, and, you know, if you had 6 hunters coming and 4 of them going to draw together, you could say, well, I had a 60% or 70% reduction, when in fact maybe only one of that group didn't
Right.
draw.
And that, I've heard a few of those stories. I know some of them did have individual applicants that weren't successful, but there were some of those that were applying. They'd always done it in the buddy system, and then they all didn't draw this year, so.
Statistics, and 90% is good unless you're in the 10%.
That's right.
Any other questions, any other comments on non-agenda items? Thank you for looking that up, Nadia. Well, then let's go to some agenda items, starting with the Secretary's comments and remarks.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So an update on our agency fiscal status. We are in the stage where we are preparing for the fiscal year 2021 budget, so all our folks are bringing in their numbers. We're working on that right now. Our EDIF apportionment for 2021 will remain the same as 2020, which is just over $5 million. That's the only money we get from the state. We will hold our budget static from fiscal year 22, fiscal year 21. The only wild card in that is the issue going on in our state parks. We have some real challenges there this year. On both the revenue end and on the maintenance end. And we have a slide, if we can see it, on their revenue. Is that up there? Oh, that bottom one, Park Fee Fund revenue chart. That's perfect. Thanks, Sean. Oh, that's not perfect.
Are you going to have
Can you
more
go-
than, should we go over there? the
Oh,
commission?
we've also got handouts. Sheila, do we have?
Yeah, that, you've got a handout. It's the
Okay,
same
there,
one.
same
okay,
one,
good.
all right.
Yeah, same one.
Can you go back to the other one, Sean?
I'm working on it, hold on.
Okay, thanks. So everybody's aware, there's been a lot of water, particularly in the eastern part of the state. That's perfect, that's it. That's caused problems for months. Back in May, Linda's told us that more than 50% of their funds come between, in May, June, July, August for the whole year. So our flooding started prior to May, certainly affected Memorial Day weekend as well as 4th of July weekend. Now we're coming up on Labor Day and we're still having significant effects. I will tell you that I mentioned this in previous commission meetings. Our park staff's really impressive on several counts. Very knowledgeable about how they had to prepare their facilities for inundation when they saw what was coming. They did a really expert job, I felt, of stabilizing things and getting them in a situation to minimize the damage. Of course, nobody expected the water to be up for this long. That's, as I travel around the state, that's the comment I hear from everybody is we've had bad floods in the past, but never this long. So as floodwaters come down, we're still very uncertain about what the maintenance costs will be, but certainly structures electrical systems, roads, campsites, everything's going to be in question. So we're concerned about that. And so far, we haven't seen much in the way of expenses associated with those. We're cleaning up a little bit of debris, but mainly the extra expense we've had thus far has been in labor, in extra hours spent to keep areas barricaded and take care of the people that want to go where they shouldn't go, and a variety of things like that. Our park staff has been really diligent about that, and it's challenging because they've been criticized by people who come to the park and say, you know, I depend on this for my summer recreation. My family does, and you aren't letting us in. And it's obvious we can't. But at the same time, I will tell you that from the very beginning, Linda and her staff have been focused on communicating the status of the parks. And part of that is to let people know now that waters are coming down in some areas. We're opening up this campground, and next week we expect to have this campground open. So we're trying to keep people updated on that. We've seen some exciting things. There's folks that have been dying to get out there all summer, and now they're starting to make reservations for the fall. So we appreciate their confidence that the areas will get better. What this graph shows is you can follow the lines for the different budget years going back starting in 2014. But if you see the gold one for fiscal year 19, you see everything was looking normal going right up till that's May of this year. But then we take the steep drop based on what happened after that, and that's what we're trying to recover from. As I said, people are optimistic. They are starting to make reservations for fall, kind of betting on the come, but we think that's not overly optimistic. Our folks are very aggressively trying to open up those campsites. I know I live between Pomona and Melbourne, and I see updates all the time about this boat ramp's open now, this campground's open now, and it's so things are going in the right direction. But it's clearly a challenge. We lost about $1 million. That drop you see there, that's about what that represents. We're updating the governor's office on a month-by-month basis. We'll find out about the maintenance requirements here soon. We'll be starting to add those up, and those will really escalate in the next couple months as we identify what we have to fix. I would point out that FEMA emergencies have been declared in, I think, 66 counties, and a lot of those cover, not all, but a lot of them cover our campgrounds. And so we are documenting expenses to submit to that. We're going to take every advantage of that we can, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that. There's uncertainty as to what they'll reimburse. The time frame is very uncertain, how long it'll take to get that back. So we know we're going to run into a shortfall. We know we will. We just don't know how big it is. But we'll be glad to update you, and we're updating the public as we get those numbers on a month-by-month basis, as I said. The only other comments I'd make, and I'll be glad to try to answer questions, the Wildlife Fee Fund is also down. As you can imagine, the ground that we typically lease out to farmers around these reservoirs has been impacted by flooding, still is. There's going to be a lot of debris cleanup on those lands. So we're down about 7.5% from this time last year. We feel like we're going to get hit harder in the second half of the year. A lot of those farmers made payments early, and now we're working with them. But we don't expect much money coming in late in the year on a lot of our eastern reservoirs. The last thing I'd mention is Steve Adams updated us about Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson funds. Those are the federal funds that we get based on what sportsmen and women pay for recreational items. So Pittman Robertson funds are expected to be down about 15% next year as a result of lower sales. Dingle Johnson is expected to be up slightly, about 3%. And those are our forecasts, but we'll update you over time as we get better numbers. And with that, I'd stand for questions.
Anybody have any questions for the Secretary? You know, we're going to be looking at FEMA. I don't know, Gary and I were talking beforehand. Do you think there's any money coming from the KDOT or something like that for some of the roads that maybe we could get some help from?
We certainly are concerned about our roads because being inundated for that period of time, we don't know, Troy could probably tell us better than any of us how those might fare when the water comes down after having been saturated that long. But we haven't heard anything from KDOT. We know a lot of their roads have suffered, and we get money currently for road work, road repairs from KDOT, but we haven't explored. Linda, I don't know if you've heard anything about supplemental funds? No? Okay, so not so far, Mr. Chairman.
We don't even know what our damage is yet till the water
Correct,
comes
right.
down. So.
We've still got water over a lot of that stuff.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So do we approach FEMA as an aggregate total as an agency, or do we have to go by county?
The process works on a county by county basis. So, and that's, so that's the way we're approaching it. We're just trying to play by their rules and give us the best chance of getting as much money back as we can.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next up is Levi on big game regulations and some deer research.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. So today I'm introducing the big game regulations that are up for consideration for revisions. I'll start with the permanent regulations, where we have a few options that the department is currently considering internally and would like public comment on. The first one will be the KAR 115-4-2, which is big game general provisions. Some options looking at dealing with the growing issue of chronic wasting disease in Kansas. And many states have restrictions on moving deer carcasses around to try and minimize the spread of the disease by human means. And so one option that is being considered is to limit whole carcass movement to within the unit that the deer was killed in, and then only allow quartered meat and the cleaned antlers and skull plate, the hide without meat or skull, finished taxidermy mounts or boned out meat. Basically the goal is to leave the majority of the central nervous system, which is the most dangerous part of the carcass for infecting a new area, which would basically be the spinal column and the brain in the skull. And so that
leaving that where it was harvested.
Leave that where it was harvested. And with that, because the very best top end recommendation is that you only move boned out meat, but that's going to be pretty hard on a hunter, especially somebody that harvests a deer right at the end of shooting time, and now they've got to try and bone a whole deer out in the dark. And this is being looked at as potentially less onerous on the hunter to actually be able to do that easier. And also we would then extend that to any deer coming into the state from out of state needs to be in that same condition, no spine or head. This also requires us to adjust how we maintain proof of sex. Right now, the way hunters have to maintain proof of sex is to leave the head naturally attached to the carcass. And so the option there is to either they could use the photo check registration that we have currently if they choose to, that's optional, and leave all but the meat and if it's a trophy, to take the antlers with them. The other option is to leave the section of hide that where the genitals would be attached to a quarter as proof of sex. And that would be only for hunters hunting with the antlerless only permit or harvesting that deer on that, because currently hunters that harvest the deer on an either sex permit don't have to maintain that.
Okay, can I ask some questions about that
Yes,
now?
absolutely.
Okay, so I shoot a deer, I bring it. I cut it up. That's a permitted activity.
It would
Under this,
under this,
as long as I don't go past the management unit with the spinal cord.
yes,
I go get a deer, I throw it in the pickup, I take it to the locker plant. That's okay as long as the locker plant is in the deer management unit.
yes,
I'm on the other side of the highway unit than the locker plant. I load it in the pickup and take it to the locker plant. Does the locker plant have to make sure that all the stuff goes back to the other side of the highway? What do we do there?
it shouldn't have left in the first place.
Well, that's what
And it is, there's always going to be an issue with somebody is going to be split by the boundary.
it's going to be a bigger issue, the fact that there's a serious shortage of deer processors. And in certain areas, they're just not there. And you have to travel. In my particular case, I hunt in Unit 12, and the processor happens to be inside it into town, to where I can make that work. But I can see a lot of problems with people taking that to a locker plant, to where to be in clear violation. You look at the locker plants, there's some deer management units that may not even have anybody who'll do it.
Yes. But it is, do we weigh that against the risk to our deer herd, especially in the eastern Kansas where we haven't detected it yet?
I understand.
And we don't really have any say in what locker plants do with, the waste. I mean, if, they could be shown to, dispose of it properly, maybe we would be considering alternative language here a little more strongly.
Well, right now, locker plants want you to sign that the deer hadn't been tested because they want absolutely nothing to do with solving the CWD problem.
Yeah.
Because the waste materials go into a dog food line someplace or fertilizer or something, and they don't want an infected animal to show up, and then everybody screams and hollers, and they've got to shut down that manufacturing process. I think you're going to have a lot of issues if you're not going to allow deer to be moved to a locker plant.
Yeah, and we realize that this would be a, immense change, and we wanted to get it out in front of folks as soon as possible. So, maybe we want to try and work out a lot of those issues as best
We
we
are
can.
not the only state that's really grappling with this type of thing,
No.
as to what to do.
And
So
this
your
would bring
ideas
us-
are not out in left field in this area of research.
No, this would bring us more in line, actually, towards probably the middle of the pack as far as these kind of restrictions for different states. Also, part of that is, I got a phone call this year from the Ohio deer biologist because they had a deer that tested positive in Ohio that they thought was from their wild herd, and it had been mislabeled, and it came from Rooks County, Kansas. So, not necessarily, are we, Ohio is Ohio, but I sure don't want to be sending it to them if I can help it. I also don't want other states that have it to be sending it back here or having it brought back here. We also, there's some growing evidence that there are strains of chronic wasting disease that are more or less infectious. And so, it's kind of the, maybe we deal with the devil we know right now.
is your research have anything to do with baiting?
The current research project does not. We are currently working on a human dimensions survey to ask hunters about it, and that will be asking about baiting and feeding.
There are some states that feel that baiting is a CWD risk.
Yes.
It's kind of a little cottage industry here in Kansas, so we don't want to deal with that. But my recommendation is that we try to figure some way to liberalize the availability to use locker plants. And I don't know how we go about doing that. I don't know whether we have, rather than a deer management unit, have within 50 miles from the unit of harvest. I understand where you're coming from, and I'm not sure we do not want to have CWD running wild in the herd, and we're now having it pop up here and there. And I think that we also have greater risk than locker plants with captive animals, probably baiting, although there's no absolute proof. There is a general association that when you provide baiting opportunities, you have deer congregate in an abnormally tight population group.
Yep.
And I'm not sure that maybe moving the deer is the most important of the three.
Well, the joke among deer biologists and disease folks in different states is that chronic wasting disease spreads at 55 miles per hour. Because, yes, it will spread across the landscape through baiting and feeding, potentially with deer-to-deer contact. And that can be addressed potentially other ways. The biggest issue with moving carcasses is that, we can take it from, Rawlins County, Kansas, and, suddenly it'll be in Chautauqua County, Kansas, because we moved a carcass, dumped it, deer got infected in that area now. And that's what this is trying to prevent, is those big jumps that bring up whole new areas. So.
Well, let's continue to work on it. Do I have any other questions or comments from the commission?
I've got a couple.
Yes.
Levi, one of the things you think about is those individuals that do end up with nice deer and wanting to do taxidermy mounts. And your favorite taxidermist is likely not to be in that same unit, or there's a high probability. What about those situations?
That's why we allow would allow with this the antlers with a clean skull plate, the hide if you've cleaned it off, so you can cape the deer out in the field, take the antlers off, and take that with you that way. A potential change to it is that if you clean the brain out of the skull could go. I mean, that's an option that could be considered within that, because it is the brain stem and the spinal cord that are the major parts that we would want to leave in the field, leave where it came from.
Okay. Another one has to do with the fact with our non-resident hunters that often have 2 units that they have access to. Are they going to have a 2-unit access still to move that, or are they going to be restricted by those same rules?
It would be the same for everybody, because if you allow adjacent unit type activities, if it's in, unit 7, they could take it to unit 8, and it just keeps leapfrogging that way. Would be the potential cost of that kind of a adoption.
This one is an extrapolation anticipating things down the road. It's hard enough to hunt during muzzleloader season because it's hot, and the risk of wasting an entire deer by shooting it in the hot weather. Now it's not only hot, and you have to do the skinning, all that field dressing. It wipes out muzzleloader hunting almost for some individuals that are traveling and hunting. Is there, I guess it's more a comment than a question, is there going to be a way to look at that down the road as far as an adjustment so that there's still a legit muzzleloader season?
Yeah, I mean, we'd continue to look at adjustments. And, you know, part of that too is by cutting the deer up this much, you would allow it to cool much faster than a whole carcass. And that's another reason why the option that we'd want to look at would be, you know, just quartering and not necessarily going with the, you know, what's the most recommended restriction, which would be completely boning out the meat in the field. That even myself as a deer hunter, that would be pretty onerous to have to debone the entire thing in the field. Whereas quartering and leaving the spinal column and the head in the field is, you know, a little easier.
My last question has to do a little with the ethics. And one of my fears as I read through this, was the fact that we might, either out of necessity or inadvertently, be promoting waste. We used to skin debone everything. We cut the meat out between the ribs. And in this situation, we're saying take the big chunks and go. I understand that from a physiological perspective. I'm concerned about it from an ethical perspective and what it might be communicating to people.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that, and potentially that's something we could, you know, consider in our wanton waste regulations. And, you know, we're also, with some of this, you know, we've done a recent video to, you know, show hunters how easy it is to actually collect the CWD samples that you need to have your deer tested. Going along with this, we would do a lot of outreach to show how easy it actually is to do this and what you would need to do to, you know, be legal with this.
Is this recommendation, unless amended, moving towards public hearing? Or is it that?
We're still in the internal revisions and considering, but it is such a big change that it makes sense to get it out in front of everybody to get more comment on it sooner.
Well, it's a big change. It'd also be a big change if we all got our butts kicked by CWD in 20 years too.
Yeah.
So I understand why you're doing what you're doing. I'd like to sort of look for a little softer way, and because I think that it does travel, there's probably a lot at 50, what'd you say, at 55 miles an hour? So, but if we could limit it to within the state of Kansas or within a more generous radius of where it was harvested or something like that, it might be a little easier to accommodate those people who don't want to process their own.
Yeah. And
Well, anyway, is there any comments from anybody else about this?
I just wonder realistically how many of the hunters are skilled enough to be a butcher to do all this. You know, to do a cape, cut all that out so you can take it to the taxidermy. I just wonder how many people would be skilled enough to do it.
so there's some that would not be, I'm sure.
Realistic.
You know,
Realistically speaking,
it's also, you know, our job as hunters to, you know, be the best hunters we can be and, you know, learn. and it'd be part of, having respect for the animal we harvest. So,
You're going to have so many people that have a facility at their house that's just across the boundary line, that they have the place where they can properly process the meat and save it without getting hair and all that, having access to water. You're going to have so many people that are going to be breaking the law just so they are ethically doing the right thing, taking it to their own facility. And I know there's going to be lots of people that want to take it to a locker plant, but there's a lot of people that just want to take it to their ranch house where they can do it properly and do it ethically there and not halfway do it out in the field too. So,
yeah. And one reason that, the deer management units were used is because they are, larger. They are established boundaries that hunters should already know. Because many other states on this that are doing it reduce it to the county that you kill it in. And that would definitely have a lot more people doing it. And so this was the option that would, reduce that to the lowest number while still trying to, protect the greatest area.
Your recommendation, though, as I read it, is this particular recommendation is that it just not move out of the management unit.
Yeah.
You can move the whole carcass, you can do a whole lot of things, and just make sure it stays in there.
Yep.
Yes, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, we strive all the time to simplify our regulations, make them as clear as possible, and lower the threshold for people to say, oh, I can do that. It's easy enough for me to do, understand, and do it responsibly. But if we go the other direction and educate our hunters more, talk in terms of the movement of this disease from west to east in Kansas, one of the potentials is we could talk about that front, that CWD front, and identify that on an annual basis and say, you can't move it from CWD territory east out of that front, but you can always go west, right? You could take a clean deer carcass and move it to your taxidermist or your locker plant to the west, from uninfected to infected, right? Because you're not going to cause any harm that way, or from the eastern edge of that front, as long as your area is infected, and move as far west as you want to go. Right, so that's a thought. That does complicate things, and that goes against our general standard, but that's a potential.
Levi, we talked at a previous commission meeting about upping the testing procedure for this. Has there been any more talk on that, or is...
That's under discussion too, what we can do with that. We're also looking at some additional research work with that.
The problem with the testing, and I like the idea, I wish there was some like a little quick pregnancy test that boom, well, okay, you got a bad deer. And the problem is that by the time you find out, you got to figure out something to do with it. You can't leave it in the field. You got to get it in refrigeration. You have to do something. So
yeah, the fastest any state's been able to get results.
As we do this, the unenlightened reporter will start printing things, and everybody will panic. Any other questions? Anybody?
The only other comment I'd make, Mr. Chair, is to Levi's point, we're trying to figure out ways to lower the cost of the test, to speed it all up, to just make it all more user-friendly. And we're working on that. And you might describe the video you guys did recently.
Yes, the current video, we use the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab where the testing goes for chronic wasting disease. And the video they had out on how to collect the samples basically involve, 14 different kinds of tools you needed and how to dissect the head in a laboratory to get to the, what you need for the samples, the lymph nodes and the brainstem. And so we recently partnered with them to produce a video that basically shows hunters how to go collect the samples you need for CWD testing with the same knife that they're going to field dress the deer and a Ziploc bag to put the stuff in until they can put it in a vial of the buffered formalin to send it in. Trying to make this as easy as possible and provide all the materials for folks to be able to educate themselves on how to do it quick and simple.
Well, keep doing what you're doing. Keep working on it. And thank you. If nobody else, yep, okay.
What did you say the fastest test was? What did you say, 2 weeks?
The fastest I've heard of any state being able to get results back to the hunter is 2 weeks. And nobody that I've talked to that are deer managers or wildlife disease folks are happy with any of that. Because somebody's already invested a lot in that deer. And you're right. Exactly correct, Mr. Chairman, in that if we could find something that was a quick, deer's on the ground, I take the sample, put it in there, and it tells me positive, negative, that would be the best thing. In fact, if we had that, I'm not sure we'd have to consider any kind of a carcass movement because basically, if it tests positive, you leave it there. So, and notify us, let us know it's been detected, so. But we don't have that yet. But I do know that there are quite a few folks that are a lot smarter than I am working on trying to develop something.
Well, one question, I'll quit. The Ohio deer, was it a dead carcass?
It was a whole carcass that got taken to the taxidermist. No, it was harvested by a hunter from Ohio in Rooks County, Kansas. So, and caused quite a stir up there because the only reason they detected it was because it was mislabeled as an Ohio deer, and they went and tested it, and then when they found it was a positive, they thought they had had their first positive detection for wild deer in the state. Talked to the hunter, and
Yeah, if any of us get phone calls, tell them call Levi. All right. I guess that, anybody other questions? Thank you.
welcome. All right, so we go to our next regulation that we're considering an option on is 115 4-4, which is the equipment. Typically, we look at this over some time. We were asked to evaluate the use of draw locking devices on bows, on vertical bows. And so we're looking into that, and so we're asking for comments on an option that would allow the use of those. I'm also additionally trying to set up a kind of a little test day potentially associated with the commission meeting with these, or have a manufacturer demonstration of it. So
That's a good idea.
that's what the only thing we're looking at with the equipment right now.
Anybody have any comments on that? Does the archery lobby like or not like that?
So
Why not?
Gary Cook, Fort Scott. Basically, the thing about archery, the hard part about archery is moving. You've already got the crossbows. If somebody wants to shoot a crossbow, shoot a crossbow. We don't need any more gadgets.
Is that from a sporting perspective?
Yes.
Not, or no safety, no, it's kind of not fair if you want to.
It's not fair.
Not ethical.
For years and years, crossbows were legal for handicap, and we were really happy with that. And then it was changed to where it was youth and seniors, and now it's anybody that wants to shoot one.
Okay. We've got an archer that wants to use one, and we're going to have a discussion with that archer. And he's going to say, but you let crossbows. Is there some ammunition that we can say, but the reason we don't allow vertical bows is because it's not a safe, or it's this, it's that.
A draw lock would be harder to shoot than a vertical bow without one, because in order to hold a bow, you have pressure. Without having to hold it, you don't have any pressure. It's hard to stand here and hold your hand out here, holding a bow. They're not as accurate.
So, all right.
I've tried them.
I
They're not as accurate because you can't hold it still enough without any pressure. Shooting a gun, you hold pressure against yourself, right? That's to stabilize it. Same way with a crossbow. You hold it tight against you to stabilize it. Of course, most people with guns and crossbows anymore use those.
Why would somebody want to use it?
I have no idea. Other than it does keep you from moving. You don't have to move. That's the only thing I can think of why you'd want to use one. If it's the fact that you can't pull a bow, shoot a crossbow.
Okay, did you get his name, Sheila?
Yes.
Okay. Doug?
I might be able to add some. The bow hunter's position on this is really based on the traditional description or definition of archery, in that it's handheld, hand-drawn, and hand-released, which was the standard Kansas used until crossbow inclusion. When you take the handheld out of it, it changes the whole basis from our perspective. And I believe too that the draw lock is still legal for somebody with a disability permit, so it's available. So it's it can add an advantage if you want someone to do it, because you can draw and cock your bow before when you set up and it's ready. It's complicated. I'm dealing with a mutual friend that's suffering from some issues and can't pull his bow anymore, but he also can't cock a crossbow. And we're kind of at a quandary, and he can't afford to buy one that cocks itself. They have those too. So it's it's complicated. And until the crossbow issue erupted a few years ago, it really was pretty insignificant. But now we've got a whole industry redefining everything for us, and some of us Luddites are still resistant. So I hope that clarifies our position a little bit.
A little bit. Crossbows, there's not a lot of difference between a locking device and a crossbow, and crossbows are already
the biggest difference
out of the bottle.
The biggest difference is
The
most of
accuracy.
the crossbows today are 150, 160 pounds, where if you still have to pull that, and this friend of mine, the issue is how he's going to pull it. It's probably going to mean that he's going to put his feet on the bow and use both hands to pull it, which is the traditional way to cock a crossbow until they got so heavy. He shoots a 30-pound recurve. He can probably cock that with a draw lock, but he tried to pull back a 160-pound crossbow, and he literally didn't move the string an inch. So it's similar, but it's not necessarily the same.
The draw lock thing, if you can pull the bow once, you can pull it
Well, Levi, continue to seek input.
All right.
I think that's your recommendation, is to
Yep.
seek input. Do you have other things you
I
want to
do.
discuss here today?
I do. Looking at 115 4-6, which is our management units. Currently, there's a small corner of Unit 10 that falls below the urban deer unit, Unit 19, and so it is completely surrounded by units 14, 11, and 19 that allow the harvest of up to 5, or the use of up to 5 antlerless deer tags. And we've had landowners within that and hunters that are down in there that are, asking that they be have a way to also use up to 5 permits or antlerless deer permits in there. It didn't make much sense to have an area with just one allowed. That's also an area that, compared to the rest of Unit 10, the deer population is doing okay, doing well. And so the option that we are looking at is to extend the boundary of 19 down along Interstate 35 to where it meets with US 75 and go back north and cover that, so that they would then fall within that urban unit and be allowed to use up to 5 whitetail antlerless only permits. And there's also some additional discussion internally about maybe trying to clean up the boundary of 19 a little bit, make it a little easier to follow. But the northern boundary, there's not any major highways to follow, and so we're currently relying on skid staff to figure out what might be better than what we're currently doing, if there is such a thing.
Anybody have any questions about this one? Okay. I guess go on to the next.
All right, 115 4-11, which is big game and wild turkey permit applications. This just, describes the general procedures, priority procedures. Also authorizes preference points. We bring it up to see if there's any wish to discuss changes for it, but currently we don't have any changes proposed or any options being considered, and we're not scheduling it for any further review if there's no comment on it.
Okay. Any questions on this one for Levi? Well, move on.
All right. Deer permits, prescriptions, and restrictions, which is 115 4-13. There's some discussion about tenant tags that we're going to be going back to with internal. Chris indicated there's some issues with the option that's listed, and so we're going to strike that for right now. The other one is that with this is that we have not been issuing any either species antlerless only permits the last few years due to concerns about mule deer. And an option that's being looked at right now is that in Deer Management Unit 1, we've had several landowner complaints about deer damage specific to mule deer up there. That is the unit where mule deer are doing by far the best in Kansas. In fact, the population in that unit is increasing. And so we're looking at a potential option to offer a very limited number of those permits up in that area again. And I don't know that this is a topic that has to be, we just have not issued any, it's just kind of announcement that we might consider doing that again to give them an additional tool up there in that area only.
Is that area easily defined within a deer management unit?
It's Deer Management Unit 1, so it is one of the units. So,
And is the whole unit big enough to where you would have either sex that people would say there doesn't need to be any in this county or in this portion?
potentially. I'm not sure how we would,
I'm not sure.
Traditionally done things by the deer management unit.
I'm
so.
not sure there's a better way than what you're suggesting. There tends to be a lot of public opinion on mule deer doe harvest. Any questions for Levi on this one? Well, you're on a roll.
All right, well, that wraps up the permanent regulations, and we can go to the 25 series regulations for seasons, if that's what's next. So, typically we've had a January antlerless season. We've had 3 different lengths of season. And this year on the deer harvest survey, we asked hunters about their satisfaction with the season in the unit that they hunt antlerless deer the most. We asked about the starting date. We asked about how they would like, set structure for that. And most folks are very happy with the January 1st start. We did ask whether or not they wanted a set number of days per season. So, it would be like 5, 10, 15 days would be your 3 lengths, no matter what date we started on, or if they would prefer to always have weekends. By far, the majority of folks have indicated that they wanted weekends included, always have at least one, even in the shortest season. But we also, in looking at their satisfaction with the length of days, the most satisfied people were the ones with the longest seasons. The folks that were actually unsatisfied with season lengths overall were the short seasons units that have had 1 day. Additionally, looking at some of the deer harvest during that period, this year we're proposing 3 lengths during the January season. And so the shortest season would be 10 days, the mid-season would be 17, and the longest would be 24 days as far as the option we're currently evaluating. And that would actually give 2 weekends in the shortest season this year. If we continued with just one, within a couple of seasons, we'd be back down to only a couple days during that season. And so that was the option that we're currently looking at internally as far as January seasons. The actual dates then otherwise are pretty much according to our traditional seasons. The youth disability start on September 5th, run through the 13th. The early muzzleloader season would be September 14th through September 27th. The archery season would open concurrently with muzzleloader season on September 14th and run to December 31st. The pre-rut whitetail antlerless only firearm season would again be Columbus Day weekend on October 10th through October 12th in 2020. The regular firearm seasons would start again the Wednesday after Thanksgiving on December 2nd and run through December 13th. We would run then the first extended antlerless season the 1st of January through January 10th. The second extended would be January 1st through January 17th. The third extended would be January 1st through January 24th. And the extended archery, which is currently only in Deer Management Unit 19, would run January 25th through the 31st.
This would replace the 2-day season with a 10-day season,
It would.
which should make the KLA happy.
So, and we've also in units, most units we're seeing, pretty decent deer growth, population growth, or stability. We do see some areas where, trying to maintain more pressure on the deer herd is good from a chronic wasting disease management standpoint. And we would still, be looking at the actual number of antlerless tags that would be allowed to use in those.
And what we find, I think you mentioned to me earlier, that we don't have a whole lot of January deer hunters anyway.
No, less than 10% of our total deer harvest comes in January.
And the fear of inadvertently harvesting a male deer just is within the statistics of being acceptable.
Very, very much so. It's. I think last year was less than 900 across the entire state. So.
Are there any questions for Levi on this issue?
Levi, are you talking about just going a 10-day season
On
the extended season?
That would be a year from now.
Yeah, that would be a year from now. And so the short season, so if a unit currently is under, has been under 1 day or 3 days, it would go to a 10. That's the general, folks wanted more days, and looking at the amount of harvest during that time, it's.
The later you go in January, the more bucks are going to get killed.
So, and we're not going that much later than we would if the first fell on, a Wednesday or a Tuesday, and we were including a weekend all the time too. So, but we were going to be really short again, even if we went to always including a weekend. So, and this also allows for, a little more for bad weather that occurs during that time, whereas, only a couple days you may be weathered out from hunting. So,
Any more questions for Levi?
all right, we'll do some fun stuff and talk about some big research project.
Okay.
And I have a presentation if you would all like to. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the current deer research project we've got going on in Kansas right now, out west. This is the kind of the middle of the second year of the project so far, where we are. There's the big fancy name for the project: survival rates, habitat selection, and movement of sympatric mule deer and white-tailed deer in Kansas. Basically, we're looking at how well do they live. What rate do they die? Where do they like to live? What habitat do they want to be in? Where are they going? Where do they spend their time? And sympatric's just a big fancy word to say that they live in the same place. So we're working with K-State through the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit with Dr. David Hokus, and then Dr. Andrew Ricketts through their Department of Horticulture and Natural Resources with the Wildlife and Outdoor Enterprise Management Program. And then also the Kansas Bowhunters Association graciously provided additional funding for the project. And I've also provided some volunteers to help with that. And there's no way we could do a project like this in Kansas without the many private landowners that are allowing us access and the ability to work on their land. So some of the project goals are to find out the survival rates of adult mule deer and white-tailed deer on the landscape. Many of the many of the past studies that have been done outside of the Great Plains, or they've been done on the extreme north or south ends of it, and not under the same conditions that we would necessarily have in Kansas, because we don't necessarily have the same winters that they have in the Dakotas. We don't necessarily have the same summers that they have in southern Texas. And so just getting a good grasp of that, to also, look at other additional forms of mortality besides hunting, deer vehicle accidents, potentially predation, those sort of things. Also, we want to look at the habitat selection, especially of female deer, with focusing on what they need when they are fawning. Potentially, there has been the thought that white-tailed deer are more aggressive than mule deer and may push them out of the better habitat, and so needed to evaluate that. Also, with the changes in the landscape that have occurred over time, just having a better handle on how those have affected where deer occur, what they're using. We're also looking at the vulnerability and relative risk of mortality for white-tailed deer and mule deer during hunting seasons, just to establish just how vulnerable are deer to harvest. And then we also want to get the survival rates and what causes deer fawns to die, whether that be exposure to the elements, disease, predation, and then also try and determine how many of those fawns survive from being born until they actually become basically an adult, and recruit to where they'll have a survival rate that's more like an adult deer. So our study sites are out in western Kansas. Our southern field site is down in Logan, Gove, Scott, and Lane counties, where those meet. This site is characterized by a little more agriculture spread throughout the area. Fairly dry, though, not much for riparian habitat in that. And also mostly a few landowners with large holdings. Whereas our northern field site, which is up where Decatur, Norton, Sheridan, and Graham counties meet, has less agriculture and a little more range, a little more rugged up there. There's a big riparian area right through the middle of it, and it's characterized by a lot more landowners with smaller holdings. And so it was just a monumental task to line those up, and the students that dealt with that and staff at K-State did a great job in getting that put together for this. So the tentative timeline on how this works and where we're looking at different things, we start with adult deer capture. We do that in February. We started that in February 2018. We continued again in 2019, and we will do it again in 2020. We are trying to catch 120 deer that we can put collars on to track them, and we split that between each study site, so each study site gets 60 apiece, and that 60 is split again between species, so you'll get 30 whitetails, 30 mule deer, and that 30 of each species is then split between male and female, 15 of each. We do the adult vegetation monitoring is occurring year-round, looking at what they want to use. We're capturing fawns then in May to June. We try to catch them as soon as, or quickly after they're born as we can. As of last week, I think we were, on the south study site anyways, there were no fawns. They had already captured and tracked them all to the end. They're still following a few on the north study site. And then fawn vegetation and monitoring, they're being monitored daily over the 10-week period that fawns are being followed, and then every day they get a point, and the next day after the fawn would have left that area, they will go and actually measure that vegetation at that site where the fawn was found. Just a quick thing on how we're capturing adults. We're using net gun from a helicopter, so the big orange kind of cone thing is actually what holds the net, and just to give an idea of the size of it that's being shot out, some guys helping pack one away down there. If this will work, just a quick video of the helicopter bringing a deer back in after they've netted it and restrained it and blindfolded it. They actually brought in only one there. They do bring in two at a time when they can. It is a private company that are being contracted to do that capture. Been very good. They do this all around the country, and so they're really know how to handle the animals, and we've had great luck with that. In 2018, we had to capture all 120 deer. Again, we split all those up. In 2019, the radio collars that are on the does have additional data that is collected that it's too much to actually run through the satellite system. So those collars all fall off after usually about March. And so we had to recapture all 60 does to get the next year's group out. The buck collars stay on the bucks the entire period of the study, unless they are harvested or die from some other reason. And so in 2019, we had to we caught 25 bucks to replace the ones that were mortalities in 2018. And so that was 13 white-tailed deer and 12 mule deer that we had to catch for bucks. Just a quick thought on the capture too. We are trying to catch does that are pregnant. We're also trying to catch older deer. So in some cases, we've captured some does that were not pregnant. And so that's why you see the number captured by species and study site in each year are more than 15. We've had does that just they weren't pregnant, or they were too young, or we had a couple that the veterinary on site during the captures decided needed to just be released, and so we let them go. Pregnancy rates you can see are in the 80s to 90%, and we're seeing many with singles, a fair number with twins, and only a handful of deer in 2018 actually had triplets. The deer are brought back to the does are brought back to a station where they are processed. So this is just a picture of the processing tent. The lady in the purple overalls, kind of in the middle of the tent, kind of the right side of the picture. That's the actual vet that's on there supervising all of this work. So just a quick thought on the collars. We've got 3 different kinds of collars. So if you look in the upper left corner of the slide, you can see where they're holding 2 different collars. The one in his hands are the doe collars, and so they have a VHF component, so you can actually go find them in the field. They have a GPS component that transmits points through a satellite system. They also have a store on board section that stores a lot of additional information about what the deer is doing, how fast it's moving, whether its head is up and down. That's the additional data that we have to download directly from the collar. We can't ship through the satellite system. Additionally, try and point this out. The buck collars are this one, and they have an expansion section built in so that when bucks go into rut, the collar actually expands so it doesn't choke them, but yet it's not so loose that it falls off the rest of the year. And then to the right of that, you can see the little white collar kind of laying in the grass. That is a fawn collar, and so that has a very stretchy collar so that it can expand as the fawn grows. To the far right there, that's just the ultrasound picture with the spinal column of a fawn circled. That's how we're determining if does are pregnant. We're actually ultrasounding them. And then we can also have an additional, kind of a count ahead of time of how many fawns we should be looking for when she has them in the spring. All the collars have the contact information for the Kansas State researchers on them, so that anybody that harvests the deer or hits one can contact them so we can get to it and look at it. We also are taking disease samples if we can. The thing in the middle on the bottom, that is a vaginal implant transmitter. That is implanted into the doe so that when she has her fawns, it'll get kicked out and start pinging away so that we have a general area where to start looking for fawns, which makes it much easier than just trying to go and determine when she's not pregnant. And because getting on fawns, catching them is fairly early is about the only way you can, because a week or so down the road, you're not going to be able to catch them. And so that's the best way. It actually links to the collar so that when it gets kicked out during birth, the researchers in the field will actually get a text and an email saying, hey, this one's kicked out, you should go look for it and be looking for fawns. And then just a picture, they're actually collaring a fawn. It's blindfolded, and then they just expand the collar and slip it over the head. And then those collars send basically a data file to the researchers that just show, a bunch of points, and they have the actual GPS location and then an ID, so you know which deer's been where. And just to give you an idea of the expanse of that, if you look at the bottom part of that area, you'll see those little circles. That's quarter section center pivot irrigation out there. So the deer are spread out over a pretty fair area. And so from those points, you actually can develop a home range of where the deer's been, where it's spending its time. We're looking at a couple different levels. The blue line is the 95%, so that's 95% of the time that's where the deer is. The green in the middle is the 50, so that's about where it is for half of the time. And so that just gives us a good look at, we can now go back and look what's the percentage of that home range that has crops in it or rangeland or something else. And we use 95% instead of 100% because, if the deer is near the edge of the home range and somebody spooks it, it may run quite a ways and be well outside of where it would normally spend time. And so just some thoughts. That was a doe. We're seeing that, when does are pregnant, they're spending, time over a fairly good size area. 7.91 kilometers is about 3 square miles there. We see a big reduction when they have a fawn on the ground, and then once they're weaning that fawn, we see that start to grow again. And we're seeing more similarities between the different study sites than we necessarily are between the species. One thing with this, if the trend continues, this is preliminary data. If it continues, we're going to see some home ranges that are bigger than a lot of the current published studies have for deer outside of migratory herds. So pretty exciting to see. This is basically a survival curve for bucks. Right now, that we're in the middle of the second year, and so this is basically the first fall's worth of data. So this is about as much as could be determined right now. But that darkest shaded section up there is rifle season. So, basically for adult male deer, as we would expect, hunting is pretty much the major mortality factor for them. And we're not seeing too different in 1 year's worth of information of survival rates. What we do have a little more information from, though, right now is fawn captures. So in 2018, they caught 44. Pretty evenly split between whitetail and mule deer between the study sites. A little heavier on males in that case. And then of those 44, they were able to catch 15 sets of twins. In 2019, they did better. They caught 56 total. Again, they're fairly split between species, sex, and study site. And they were able to capture, looks like one set of triplets even, or did have one. So for fawn survival, that's just the 10-week survival. Everybody starts out alive, and by the end of 10 weeks, we were seeing, just from that one season's worth of information, about 27% survival. So by 70 days after they're born, only about 26% or 27% of the fawns will be alive yet. And the biggest thing we see that factors into that, which has been, follows right along what's been seen everywhere else, is that how heavy the fawn is at birth is the major thing dictating whether they survive. If you think about it, you're putting a small, fragile fawn on the ground. They weigh 6 to 8 pounds, and expecting them, there you are, survive. Live in the weather. Trying to avoid coyotes by not moving. Different things. Right now, exposure's been a big cause of mortality for fawns. Predation has been important. Predation can be kind of tough because you've sometimes got to determine whether the fawn died before the coyote got to it, or did the coyote actually kill it. Those are major ones. We also have quite a few that we just can't tell, because by the time you get to the location of the collar, after it signals mortality, it's just bits and pieces. So getting there sooner is better, but nothing too terribly groundbreaking here. As far as the vegetation work with fawns, basically the deer are selecting areas that have more cover, and very similar between species. There's kind of a sweet spot there when you look at that curve of what they want. But more cover, obviously you hide better if there's more cover to hide behind. And then I thought I'd just kind of give you some pictures of what else has been going on. People have been seeing deer on trail cameras. We've had some of our law enforcement folks be able to come out and assist with the captures. It's hard to see probably, but that tent, that thing is stretched tight in the wind. We've had, it's always you never know quite what you're going to do with the weather in February, trying to get out there and fly a helicopter around. And so this year we had some delays because you were about getting blown off the hilltops. But that conclude what I've got to say about it. So take questions if anybody's got any.
Are there any questions for Levi? That's very interesting. Thank you.
Welcome. That wraps up what I've got to say, Mr. Chairman. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much.
welcome.
Is it possible to test for chronic wasting disease while they're alive?
There is a test. It is not very good. Depending on which study you look at, it is anywhere from 85% to go ahead and just flip a quarter and you'll be just as accurate as the test, unfortunately. That's something that's additionally being looked at in that testing research. And we did do that the very first season of it, but the reliability of it's just so low that the cost isn't really worth it right now. And also because in the end, we're trying to get to all the mortalities and test them as if they're dead or when they die. So, and see if they've got it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Let's take a 10-minute break, be back at 3:15.